Hello, this lecture is on the medieval pandemic known as the Black Death. Also, I will be taking a look at the poor state of medicine in the medieval age. Diseases throughout history have been the scourge of human societies, but diseases tend to be endemic. In other words, they are regularly found among particular people or in a certain area. From another dictionary, endemic is, quote, a disease that is prevalent in or restricted to a particular location, region, or population. For example, malaria is said to be endemic to tropical regions. It is less the case that diseases are epidemic, defined as widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. In other words, an epidemic disease is one, quote, affecting many persons at the same time and spreading from person to person in a locality where the disease is not permanently prevalent. In comparison to an epidemic disease, quote, a pandemic disease is an epidemic that has spread over a large area, that is, it's prevalent throughout an entire country, continent, or the whole world. One epidemic that broke out in the late 2nd century was smallpox that spread throughout the Roman Empire. In the year 251, measles broke out. In the mid-6th century, the bacterium Yersinia pestis hit Africa and spread to Europe before burning out by the 8th century. For the next several centuries, Europeans experienced few epidemics, for once the pool of diseases to which they were exposed stabilized and their immune systems were able to adapt. In his book, The Columbian Exchange, Alfred Crosby writes, quote, "It is true that man did not achieve perfect accommodation with his microscopic parasites. Mutation, ecological changes, and migration brought the Black Death to Europe, and few men lived to the proverbial age of 70 years and 10 without knowing epidemic disease. Yet, ecological stability did tend to create a crude kind of mutual toleration between human host and parasite. Most Europeans, for instance, survived measles and tuberculosis, and most West Africans survived yellow fever and malaria. Migration of man and his maladies is the chief cause of epidemics. And when migration takes place, those creatures who have been longest in isolation suffer most, for their genetic material has been least tempered by the variety of world diseases." End quote. The impact of disease on people varied. A significant factor on the deadliness of a disease was urban growth. On the one hand, the rise of cities in the medieval age was a positive development. Cities generated creativity and wealth. It was in the city where the arts and science progressed. The scholarship on creative personalities indicates that the complexity and diversity of the city had a constructive impact on people of all ages. For example, one scholar points out that Children who grew up in cities were more likely to become artists and scientists just because there is a lot of art and science going on all about them. Cities attracted investment, which led to business growth. So that's the positive side. On the other hand, the rise of cities brought conditions that encouraged disease. While cities grew, there was little understanding of proper health alterations. People lived in crowded buildings and threw their garbage and human waste on city streets. Bacteria thrived in the garbage. Human contact with bacteria could occur from lice on people's clothing. Population density could bring serious health issues, especially in the centuries before there was an understanding of germ theory and cleanliness. In the mid-14th century, Asia, Africa, and Europe experienced a horrific health disaster as once again, according to some scholars, Yersinia pestis struck again. Although there is some debate on what was the cause of this disease in the mid-14th century. The impact certainly was brutal for Europeans who had already suffered the lasting effects of crop failures and famine during the first half of the 14th century. One other point about the 14th century is that the 1300s witnessed significant climate change. For example, in Northern Europe, the winters became longer and colder. Grape cultivation disappeared from England. It was too cold in Norway for grain to ripen. 3 times the entire Baltic Sea froze over. The benefits of the climate change of the previous centuries were gone. For example, the climate change of warmer conditions, known as the medieval warm period, that helped societies flourish, was replaced with a colder climate. The story of the Black Death in Europe begins not with Westerners, but with China. With little regard for political organization, the nomadic Mongols lived on the highland regions of Eastern Central Asia. In the early 1200s, this changed when Genghis Khan forged the Mughal people together and built the largest empire of the world had ever seen. The vast empire that stretched from China to Persia lasted about a century before breaking into smaller units. The Mongols depended on commerce with non-nomadic peoples, and consequently, they secured trade routes to guarantee the safety of merchants passing through their territories. With their promotion of trade, the Mongols unwittingly expedited the spread of bubonic plague, and this began in southwestern China. The disease inflamed lymph nodes in the neck, armpit, and groin areas was terrible to see. Internal hemorrhaging often discolored the inflammations known as buboes, which gave rise to the term bubonic. And because of the black and purple swellings, most Europeans referred to the plague as the Black Death. Many other medieval people called it the pestilence. The plague was transmitted by fleas that hitched a ride on Mongol livestock or on rats in contact with grain transports. When a person was bit by a flea, the plague bacilli went into the person's bloodstream. If the person sneezed, others were at risk of getting the disease. The plague took root in the trading cities of Central Asia, where there were abundant domestic animals and rodents. In a region near Beijing, approximately 90% of the population perished. Some scholars estimate that the population of China fell from 120 million to 80 million in the last half of the 14th century. Moving westward on the Silk Road, the overland route through Central Asia, the plague reached the Black Sea ports in the year 1346. Emperor John VI of the Byzantine Empire, who lost a son to the disease, wrote, quote, "Upon arrival in Constantinople, she, the empress, found Andronicus, the youngest born, dead from the invading plague, which attacked almost all the sea coasts of the world and killed most of their people. Those who fled to the west from the plague-infected ports spread the disease to the Mediterranean Sea. By 1348, epidemics broke out in the Islamic world. One 14th century Muslim historian declared, quote, "Civilization in the East and the West was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out." Egypt was hit so bad that it did not regain the numbers of its former population until the 19th century. The plague was the most devastating natural disaster in European history. From the years 1347 to 1351, all of Europe suffered. And we can see the decline in population there in England. But it hit all regions. Italy's crowded cities lost as much as 60% of their population. One Italian wrote, quote, "In the year of our Lord, 1348, the deadly plague broke out in the great city of Florence, most beautiful of Italian cities. Whether through the operation of the heavenly bodies or because of our own iniquities, which the just wrath of God sought to correct, the plague had risen in the East some years before, causing the death of countless human beings." There were villages where everyone died. Many monasteries and nunneries were wiped out. The number of universities in Europe fell from 30 in the year 1349 to 10 by the year 1400. Estimates have the total number of European dead ranging from 30 to 38 million, or about half the population of Europe. Beyond the devastating story of massive death numbers, the Black Death influenced the course of civilized development in Europe and Asia for centuries. Historians assessing the impact of the Black Death point to societal upheaval and economic dislocation. Many people became paralyzed with fear and they responded irrationally. For example, people turned on minorities. And one terrible case is the case of the Jews. Fearful and angry people destroyed over 200 Jewish communities. Some argue that the economic consequences were severe, with trade and industry declining significantly. For example, after the Black Death, Florence woolen industry produced 1/3 of its production of the pre-plague years. There were many acts of revolt as the masses fought against increased taxation from their political overlords. As stated in one history text, every cloud is said to have a silver lining, and this held true even for the 14th century Black Plague. Scholars acknowledge the terrible human tragedy, but see some positive consequences. The plague reduced pressure on Europe's food supply, and there was more land available. Survivors and their children lived better lives. The plague caused a labor shortage, and the simple matter of supply and demand meant higher wages for workers. Responding to this, politicians found this troubling, so they imposed wage limits on the workers. For example, the English Parliament passed a statute of laborers in 1349 that fixed wages at levels from the year 1346. The state also passed laws to keep peasants on the land. As one sees in history, the state, led by powerful leaders, sought to control the common masses. The lessons of economic history inform us that when governments attempt to manipulate market forces, economic conditions often worsen. In the case of England, landlords evaded the law by adding non-cash inducement to their offers to employees. Despite the wishes of powerful people, the plague led to more freedom and choice for many of the common masses. So there was a skirting of some of this legislation that others recognize as being destructive. Consequently, on there being more positive consequences, we have countless serfs becoming landholders, becoming free tenants. If the state did not pass laws to restrict the freedom of peasants, the free labor was now not bound to one village, town, or master, but free to hire himself to the employer and employment of his choice. Employment in a city was more lucrative. Such freedom resulted in greater productivity, with free tenants having more motivation to work. Agricultural production did not decline to the degree that one would expect with the loss of so many to the Black Death. Eventual agricultural surpluses depressed food prices and spurred urban growth. By the end of the 1300s, Western Europe was more urban than before the plague. So after the plague, factories all across Europe, quote, became busier than ever. The transportation system ran at full capacity. The banking ledger showed remarkable incomes, And in many places, ordinary people enjoyed a higher standard of living. End of quote. Because of the poor state of medicine, there was very little that could be done for those exposed to the Black Death. Many saw the death as God's punishment of sin. So what exactly was the state of medicine in the medieval period? Medicine was a combination of diet, exercise, prayer, but also superstition. Some people resorted to magical amulets and ideas about celestial forces. Astrology was used to explain illness also. The major groups of medical professionals were faith healers, apothecaries, physicians, and barber surgeons. So I'll just briefly say a word about each of these four. Faith healers believed that demons and evil spirits cause disease. They treated their patients by driving out the demon. And this would be where the term we use is exorcism. Casting out devils was tricky business. One rule was to keep your mouth closed so that the exiting devil did not enter you. A more legitimate treatment was the healing power of prayer. Faith healing through prayer was especially effective in the treatment of mental disorders. One example being depression. And this is, mental disorders where the link between attitude and illness is most direct. Apothecaries, and this would be, our today's pharmacists, they use herbs, drugs, and other concoctions to treat illness. Apothecaries not only prescribed drugs and medicine, but they also made them. However, the process of making remedies was not standardized. Prescriptions for illnesses could consist of numerous drugs. Even for the same illness, the concoctions of each apothecary would vary wildly from each other. And desperate people were willing to believe the promises of those claiming that their concoctions were effective. The third major group were the physicians. They usually received their training by apprenticeship under an established physician, training in a hospital, and the taking of university courses. Physicians often diagnose problems by examining the urine and blood of the patient. As historians claim, the urine flask was the medieval equivalent of the stethoscope, the badge of the physician. Despite their training, physicians continued to be guided with a significant degree of misinformation. For example, bloodletting or purging was still accepted as a medical cure-all. It was believed that the removal of bad blood was essential for treatment. From the Greeks, there was the idea that an imbalance of humors or fluids in the body was the cause of illness. The fourth group was the barber surgeon. The physicians of the day detested those who practiced any form of operative surgery. One notable barber surgeon was Frenchman Ambroise Paré, born in 1510. in 1532, he went to Paris to work as an unlettered barber surgeon. It was on the battlefield that offered Perret an opportunity to practice his art. He came upon 3 unconscious soldiers whose clothes had been burnt by gunpowder. An old soldier, informed that they could not be cured, gently cut their throats, stating that he prayed to God that whensoever he should be in such a case, that he might find someone that would do as much to him. The knowledge and practice of the surgeons was crude and cruel, and some patients chose death rather than submit to surgical operations. It was normal for surgeons to view gunshot wounds as poisonous, to be treated with boiling oil. After applying all the oil he had to the wounded soldiers, Perret applied simple ointment to the remaining injured. Well, the following day, he discovered that those who received ointment were in far better shape than those who had received the boiling oil. And this was an important discovery. When Perret was not on the battlefield, he wrote of his medical discoveries. His first book, The Method of Treating Wounds Made by Arquebuses and Other Firearms, guided young surgeons in their medical endeavors. Perret's medical innovation stood out in a period of history when there was a vacuum of general medical knowledge. Medical advance was slow. For example, William Harvey's discovery of the circulation of blood in the 1600s did not immediately translate into better treatment. Even in the 1700s, medical operations were of a brutal nature. Most procedures were performed without any painkiller. If a person broke an arm or leg, the surgeons would normally saw the limb off to obtain a plain surface that could be cauterized. Many patients who had their limbs removed died from agony and shock of such operations. Surgery continued to be performed in dirty conditions, thus infection was rampant. So often, treatment made a patient worse. Before the discovery of germ theory in the 1800s meant that medieval and post-medieval practitioners continued to transmit disease from one patient to another, unaware of antisepsis. To conclude, the years of the Black Death were frightening. It was a deadly and a terrible experience for many. Population density without an understanding of germ theory was a catastrophic mix. But there was also positive developments. There was greater economic freedom for many and an eventual rise of the standard of living. As for medieval medicine, it would be several centuries before there were major improvements in healthcare. Thank you.